Hi, I'm Heather Pemberton-Levy, host of Smarter with Gartner. We're live today at Gartner headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm here with Jaime Roca.
Hello, everybody.
And Jaime is Senior Vice President at Gartner. He leads the research practice for human resources. He's also co-author with Sari Wild of The Connector Manager, Why Some Leaders Build Exceptional Talent and Others Don't. It goes on sale next week.
Very exciting, yes.
Yeah, and I think it was about a year and a half ago that you and your colleagues realized you had something so striking in the research, you had a book.
Correct. We were doing research from our HR executives, but also leaders, and what we found is that managers are becoming more important for organizations to actually improve performance. And part of how they do that is through coaching and development, but it's just a major pain point.
And we're really excited to hear about how to get through that pain point, so stay tuned with us for the next half hour because we're going to find out what those leaders do to develop exceptional talent and what some leaders do that actually degrades it. What type of manager you are and how you can find out. And there are actually 3 ways to build high-performing employees on your teams, and we're going to let you know what those are. Yes. So stay tuned. We'll also take your questions later in the program. So hold on. You can post them in the comments section, and Jaime is going to take them later on.
Great.
So, okay, I'm sure we're all dying to know what type of manager it is that builds that exceptional talent. But before we get there, Jaime, talk to us about what the conditions were that led you to start this research. You know, we all know that it's tough to be a manager. It's tough to be managed. There are lots of challenges that we have to deal with every day in the workforce. What led you to conduct this research?
Yeah, and as we started this piece of research, we actually found, we know that managers, it's tough, but actually found that there are 3 tectonic shifts that are happening for managers. The first one is organizational changes. So as most organizations over the last 2 years, they've gone through 5 enterprise changes. So I think many of you would resonate with this: mergers and acquisition, cultural change, leadership change. So managers are having to work through that. And in addition to that, work is changing. So it's less predictable, and it's not as structured as before. And so managers are having to work through that. Long gone is the Industrial Revolution process of very set deadlines, very clear outline of what the work would look like. Now it's more dynamic, and managers need to adjust to that.
Right, and we've had to deal with some of that ourselves in our own organization, right? We had an acquisition a couple years ago, and so managers have to deal with more. How are they dealing with that? What are the expectations that the organization is putting on them?
So what we found is that when we asked HR executives and leaders what % of a manager's time should they be doing coaching and development, they actually said 36% of their time. Now, when we went and asked...
Do we all do that?
Right, so that is the question. And we went to ask managers about this, and what we got was 10% of their time.
Big difference.
A big difference. So the math doesn't work. And I think part of what's happening is that managers are falling into 2 crises. The first one is a confidence crisis. When we asked managers, over 5,000 managers globally, we found that 45% of managers lack the confidence to coach on the skills employees need today. This is not even future skills. So that's the confidence crisis. The second is a time crisis, which I just talked about. They don't have the capacity to actually provide the type of coaching that we're expecting from them.
And I think that a lot of managers can probably relate that coaching and development, especially if there's pressure put on them to do it a lot to help with these skills that their employees need, can sometimes fall to the bottom of the priority list.
Absolutely.
There's some stories in your book about that, right?
Yes.
And so what happens with employees if they don't have these skills that they need to have? And we're seeing this gap in how much managers are actually conducting that coaching and development.
Well, when we look at the employees are feeling unprepared and ill-equipped. And we asked over 10,000 employees globally, as you think about your current role and the most important skills, how proficient are you in those? How good are you in that? And what we found is a startling statistic. 70% of those employees said that they do not feel proficient. So in fact, the majority of our workforce right now is entering into their work with their current roles, feeling they're not going to be able to be successful.
And that's a tough place to be because work today with all of the technology advancement,
Yes.
digital transformation, everything that's happening requires more and newer skills all the time. So there's lots more pressure on organizations.
Yes.
So we needed a solution.
Correct.
And it sounds as though that's what led you to do this research.
Yeah, and so we went out and interviewed over 100 companies, hundreds of managers. We did surveys of over 10,000 employees and 5,000 managers, and we found two major conclusions. But let me start with the first one, which is as we started to look at what do managers actually do when they're coaching and developing. So we looked at over 90 variables. What are the things that they do from a time perspective to how do they run their meetings? And four major profiles of managers emerged. And so the first finding is that every manager, all 160 million of them in the world, fall into these four profiles.
Just four.
Four.
That's it.
That's it.
Okay.
And regardless of industry, geo, or tenure. And so let me just talk through a couple of them. So the first one is what we are calling the teacher. And so this individual coaches primarily on their expertise and experience. So this is the individual contributor that was really good at their role and they got promoted to management. I think most of us would relate to that one.
We've had a teacher manager at some point.
Correct. The second one is the always-on manager. Now this individual coaches continuously, coaches on a breadth of skills, always putting best foot forward to make sure that they are directing the coaching the employee needs. The third profile is the cheerleader. Now this individual has more of a hands-off approach, does provide some coaching and feedback, but is primarily more positive. So they are really, as what the cheerleader term does, it's really just enhancing and empowering the individual to perform. Mm-hmm. And then the last profile is the connector. So the connector provides very targeted feedback, targeted coaching, and when they're not well positioned to help the employee, they actually connect them to somebody else. So those are the four profiles. And what we found in nature is that pretty much across the world, regardless of industry, regardless of geo, the managers are distributed equally across all four profiles.
And my first question is, which type of manager am I?
Correct.
Right? And I'm sure you're wondering which type of manager you are. You may be thinking you're one of those types. We do have a quiz. Jaime and Sari developed a quiz with their colleagues in research for the book. It's in the book and it's also online. We'll have a link at the end of this segment, so stay tuned. Okay, so I can see myself, or I can see those different manager types, I can see embodying several of them. So I imagine when you talk to clients, they say, I think I'm a teacher and a bit of a cheerleader.
Right.
What did you find?
Well, what we found is that yes, it is true that at times we might be dabbling in some of the profiles, but most of us have a dominant approach. So when you enter a coaching or guidance conversation, you are using one of these profiles. And then what we did is we looked at, well, who is the best manager? Who's the best manager in terms of improving employer performance, improving engagement, getting the most out of their teams? And this is the second finding, which is the most startling and surprising one of all. So the manager that most organizations are following, which is a continuous coach, really this always-on manager, actually does more harm than good. They degrade performance, which is startling to think about.
Right. And how does that happen?
Well, what we found in our research is there's three management myths that are kind of reinforcing this. The first one is this idea that more coaching actually enhances employer performance. And what we found is that there's no statistical correlation between both. And so that one thing is you do not need to be doing constant feedback to actually improve performance. So that's the first one. The second myth is managers actually know what is best for employees. But when we looked at the data, we asked employees, all 10,000 of them, how much do you think that your manager actually understands what you are doing on a day-to-day basis? And in fact, only 18% said yes.
Most of them don't think their manager really.
Right,
okay.
And it's natural because I talked about the tectonic shifts. Part of that is we have a more distributed teams. The scope of employees is increasing, so it's harder for managers to keep up. And so if you don't have that insight, how can you actually be providing what is the best advice for this individual? And the third myth, this is really the big one. This is the one where the myth is managers know best. And I think for many of you, as myself a manager, I can't have the answers for all of it. It is impossible. Things are changing too quickly. And so what happens is that in many instances, managers are being told, you need to be providing guidance and feedback. You need to have the answers. And so when they don't know, they just do it by gut. They wing it. And at times, that advice is wrong. And so when it's wrong, it actually starts to then degrade performance.
So that's where actually it's more harm than good.
Correct.
So continuous coaching isn't always negative. There can be positive, but there are times when especially when you're going against these myths or when you're coaching in an area that you don't have the expertise, that's when you can really start to do some harm.
Correct. And I think, feedback is important, and it is important to be providing that and coaching, but it does not need to and should not be coming only from the manager. That's
Right.
the main thing to be thinking about.
And managers feel so much pressure to constantly coach and feel like they know best.
Yes.
So this is really striking to say, hey, you don't have to know it all.
Correct.
Because maybe if you try to, you're going to do more harm than good.
Correct.
So what's the answer? What's the solution if continuous coaching isn't it?
Well, what we found of the other profiles, so teacher and cheerleader actually do provide some uplift in terms of employee performance, right? They do have expertise on the teacher, so they're providing good feedback on their cheerleader. Just by sheer will of empowerment gets people up there. The winner is actually connector by a mile. So they actually triple the likelihood that their direct reports is going to be a high performer. And so,
Wow.
and what we found is that the connector actually, not only beyond just employee performance, they have higher engagement in their teams, loyalty, and also discretionary effort. So you're getting more from your teams than you would.
That's really striking. So connectors, who's a connector? Do we know any connectors? So, what makes up a connector manager?
So what we found is that the connector actually, they do 3 connections. So there's the employee connection, the team connection, and the organization connection. And let me
Okay.
just unbundle each one
Yeah,
of
let's break
them.
those down.
So the employee connection. So the employee connection is about, the tagline is really coach the person, not the problem. And the idea here is before you start a coaching conversation, ask better questions and ask more questions. So don't start actually meetings by how is it going, but move to questions to start with what, why, what if. And what you're trying to do is really get to build trust with your direct report, build solutions, but also just identify, is this individual really ready for the next phase of development?
Right. And I know you have some stories in the book, and one of the things I love about the book is that you have examples of people who
Yes.
have actually demonstrated this type of behavior, and sometimes they aren't ones that we would have readily thought were. I think you're going to get into one of my favorites later, but tell us about somebody who, an example where somebody might have tried some of these techniques.
Sure. So we have a story from Allie, who is a manager at Accenture, and in fact, what she was tasked with is she needed to onboard over 100 analysts, all somewhere in the early 20s, into a program. And so you could imagine from an onboarding perspective in terms of coaching and development, how is she going to be able to do that? And so she shifted from having to provide feedback and coaching all the time to asking those better questions. And those questions was really about starting meetings with, well, what is it that you need to be successful into your role right now? How can I help on that? And then also just not having a cookie cutter approach of saying, well, you are in this stage of your career, here's what you need. Actually understanding the need of that. So that's one story just around the employee connection. Let's move on to the team connection.
Okay.
Because I think that's the second one, which is really important. And the team connection really gets to this idea about ritualizing peer-to-peer connections. And part of that is, as a manager, if you don't have the answer, start to enhance where your direct reports can actually make connections for skill development. And that is your team.
And that's not something we would all think about, right? We think we have to do so much of the heavy lifting as managers ourselves, and yet we have these teams that now we could start to use to
Correct.
help build that coaching and development. And they're right there on our teams.
Correct, absolutely. And so I think one tactical way that we've seen that really works is a tool we call Each One Teach One, which comes from a government agency. So, and we've got it in the book as a tool. It is a way from when you start your next meeting with your team, have everybody identify which skill are they really good at and they're willing to share, including yourself as a manager. And so through that, you are, number one, increasing the transparency of what is available that people can tap into, and that will naturally start to create some connections.
Right. And this isn't just for teams in your classic corporate environment. You mentioned there's some government techniques,
Correct.
they're nonprofits, there's sports stories in here.
Correct.
And then you had one in, I think, a casino.
Yeah.
Kitchen.
One
right?
of the things that we found is we have a South African client of ours who is a casino and hotel organization, and the head of L&D was enamored by the idea of the connector and started to incorporate the connector principles even in an environment such as the kitchen. And so many of you can think about Hell's Kitchen or any of these
Right.
environments. It's a very hierarchical, very intense, and actually the kitchen just wasn't performing where it needed. So Steve actually brought in a connector manager as the head chef. And what he did was twofold. One is he started to create pairings between different cooks. So the molecular gastronomy cook with the traditional French cuisine cook, and trying to gel skills around that. Also just making sure that there's diversity of views in terms of how things could improve. And the result of that is that the menu improved, the overall atmosphere and environment for the kitchen improved. And so I think this idea or this example actually shows how the connector can actually move into a certain environment such as the kitchen, not just a corporate setting.
Right. Right. That's a fun story.
It is.
And if you have questions about the Connector Manager, post them in the comment section. We're going to take them in just a little bit. So before we do that, let's talk about that third connection.
Yes. So the organizational connection, this is all about once you've identified, I as a manager, I'm not best suited for this, how can I then go and make sure that I'm connecting them? And part of this is about not just sending off your employee to make a connection to somebody else. It's actually what we're calling warm up and cool down that need to happen. So it's understanding, okay, what is it that you're going to get from this connection, prepping for that, and then after the connections happen, doing a cool down where you are actually saying, well, how are you going to implement what you learned into that?
Right.
And we have a wonderful story here, which is a small organization, 15-person organization. Pranav, who's the CEO, runs a clothing organization which is called Hue and Cry in Washington, D.C. And his digital marketing manager needed to improve his skills around e-commerce. That was part of the strategy. But in a 15-person organization, he didn't have the network. So he actually started to reach out to other vendors and customers that they had to be able to make those connections. And so what he termed is these connections being benevolent outsiders. And so
I like that.
It's a great idea. So as you think about where the connections, it can be really in your team, in your organization, but also outside. And it can actually work in very small companies, even at large ones too.
Right. Many companies are working with, from freelancers to contractors to consultants to agencies that they could tap into for these types of
Correct.
connections that they might not
Correct.
think of,
Yeah.
or broader across the organization. I mean,
Correct.
there's some stories in here about bigger tools that companies built to really tap into skills across the organization. You don't have to go that far. I mean,
Correct.
this is an example of a smaller organization. but
Correct.
That's
Correct.
pretty interesting.
Yeah.
There is an example, right, of one type of connector that brought it all together.
Yeah, so we have a story, and many of you might remember July of 2018, there was a rescue mission of 13 boys, part of the Wild Boars soccer team in Thailand, that were trapped in a cave in the Chiang Rai region. And the governor of that region was in charge of orchestrating the rescue. Now, you could imagine many of these boys were under the age of 13. Many didn't know how to swim. The cave actually had flooded because of a torrential downpour during that season. And so he actually used many of the connector principles. So as an employee connection, when he first started to look at what needed to get done, he actually looked at the local divers that were trying to figure out how could they orchestrate the rescue. But what he found is that the divers themselves were sea divers, not cave divers. So that was by asking different questions to identify those solutions. On the team connection, he actually then connected the international divers. So we had divers from the US, Australia, UK, with the local divers to really create this dream team that would extract all 13 boys. And the local team brought a lot of the supplies and local language and just getting everything that needed to get done, with the international divers really bringing the expertise of cave diving. And then the last one is the organization connection, which I call really the ultimate connection in this example. He brought in Dr. Richard Harris, who is a doctor from Australia and also a cave diver. And to extract all 13 boys, they needed to be done one by one, but they needed to sedate each of the boys, put on a stretcher over a 3-hour extraction. And he needed to teach the divers how to be able to sedate the boys across the board. Now, I recognize that this is a life and death situation, and this is not what all managers experience, but this gives you the power of what the connector manager can do in certain situations.
Sure. Such an interesting story.
Yes.
But it really does help you see how bringing those skills in from different areas can make such a difference.
Correct.
And brings it home.
Yes.
Okay, so interesting. Now I'm really curious what the viewer questions might be. We're ready to take questions. I think Greg has been collecting them from those of you who've submitted them. Greg, what's our first question?
So our first question is from George. George is from Denmark, and he asks, it seems like some managers are naturally connectors. Can we actually train people to be connectors?
That's a good question.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there are some individuals that certain components of the 3 connections that I talked about that naturally they do have, right? So we did find that some individuals who have more of a bigger network in the organization naturally tend themselves into that. But I would encourage everybody that even if you think you're a connector, think about the 3 connections. Are you really doing the right questions at the beginning? Are you enhancing your team connections? And reevaluate that, because one thing to keep in mind, if you do not do the employee connection really well, it's really hard to do the rest of the connections.
Good point. And also, what's great about this book is not only the stories, but the tools and all of the questions and checklists that are in the back.
Correct.
So it actually provides questions to ask in some of those employee connection scenarios and the team connection. So it's good to check out to learn the techniques. I mean,
Correct.
the book is very much about how possible it is to become a connector manager if you're one of the other types.
And there are 2 tools in there. There's several tools, but there's kind of 2 buckets. One is really you as an organization, head of HR or head of L&D, if you're wanting to implement the connector manager principles, there's that. You as a manager, there's very tactical things that you can apply today about how you run a meeting to other things that you can be doing.
Right. Okay, do we have another question?
We do. This next one is from Jen. Jen is from Boston, and she asks, my manager is definitely an always-on manager. Can I do anything to change that?
Great question. We have a whole section in the book around that. And
Yeah, actually, right, there is.
And we talk a little bit about how to manage that. I think first and foremost, think a little bit about how you could start to see where your manager has actually had the most impact, and make that transparent to him or her, to say, here are the areas that really work. So try to guide as much as you can where you need the feedback. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is really be transparent about what are the things that you really need and where is it from a career aspiration you want to be moving forward. The third item is provide the feedback. I suspect at the end of the year there might be some feedback that can be provided. Go ahead and provide the feedback around how it makes you feel, and maybe ways that he can improve or she can improve to really make you tap your full potential.
There are some stories in here about always-on managers, and we're covering always-on managers, so you might feel some company in the book.
Correct.
Okay, I think we have time for a third question.
Our last question is from Dan. Dan is from the UK, and he asks, what's the hardest part about becoming a connector manager? The thing that most people trip over?
Oh, that's a good one.
That's a great one, yeah. I think the thing that most people think is that being a connector is making a networking connection. So I, as a manager, have identified an individual and say, you should go talk to this individual. And they think that that is actually being a connector manager, but that's actually not. That is just not precise enough. And what I talked about earlier, I think many people need to make that time around being more principled about what you're going to get from that connection and how can your direct report actually learn. Because that's what's the important part. They're going to learn and actually apply it in their job. And so that's the one thing. The other thing is that they do trip over a lot is people are just asking the wrong questions. I talked about that at the beginning. They're asking very directive questions about leading questions and not really unearthing the real problems and needs of the employee.
Okay, great. So just to wrap that up, as far as an organization trying to put into practice this, when they're an always-on organization or they've been doing a lot of continuous coaching, what's a shift that they can take to do that?
I think the main point that you need to be thinking about is, yes, regular feedback and coaching is good, but make sure that it's not just driven only by the manager. That's number one. The second thing, from a training perspective, if many of you are hoping to just start off, if you're doing training with your managers, look at the book. We have our 15 most powerful connector questions. Go get that in the hands of your managers today. That is something they can use tomorrow. And then third, start to think about how can you enhance the connections within your organization. So it could be a technology solution, as Heather alluded to earlier, but it could be as simple as just a team meeting example that I talked about earlier.
That's great. Okay, super. So thank you all for your questions. I have a few closing questions for you before we finish up that we like to ask to just get to know you a little bit better.
Sure.
Okay. What career would you have if you weren't at Gartner?
So my father was a private pilot, so I did a lot of flying, and at one point I wanted to be a commercial pilot. And once I found out the amount of travel and time away from home, I decided that was not for me. But that would have been my aspiration.
Okay, that's a fun one.
Yeah.
And you probably travel a lot now. And
well,
fly
that's the irony of it.
commercially,
Yeah,
so,
that is the irony now, because I'm traveling actually as much as a pilot,
All
probably.
right. What's your favorite city you traveled to in the last year?
So my mother lives in California, and I actually spent some time in Encinitas, California, which is
Nice.
right on the coast. Beautiful. It's a surfer town. Amazing. Just makes you kind of dream a little bit about just being out in the ocean.
That's great.
Yeah.
My daughter would love that
Yeah.
as a surfer. Okay. How do you decompress? What's on your nightstand? What are you reading right now?
I do a lot of reading. Right now I'm reading Prediction Machines by Joshua Nance. It's a great book that really unbundles AI, but as a predictive component. And so I'm very interested in figuring out how can we use that to really get ahead of not only predicting where things are moving, but specifically from a skills perspective. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking to.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Just a little light reading.
Yeah.
And finally, if technology could help one intractable problem in the world, what would it be?
Well, one thing, my wife works in public health, and one of the things that is always kind of frustrating is when you have solutions that can solve a medical problem like a disease. So, for example, malaria, right? We have over 200 million cases of malaria every year. We have a solution for it. Over 60% of them are children under the age of 5. We should solve that.
Yeah,
So,
that's a great point. Well, listen, thank you so much, Jaime. This
Thank
was
you.
really fun.
Thank you.
Interesting stories. We hope that you'll all check out the Connector Manager, which goes on sale next week. You can pre-order it now and take the quiz. Find out what type of manager you are. You're going to see a link in a couple minutes. Check out Smarter with Gartner to stay up to date on the latest technology and business trends. You can also read a lot of excerpts from the book. And we hope that you'll visit us soon and stay tuned. Thanks.